Hi, I'm Matt Wynne from Cucumber, and I'm back with part 3 of our BDD 101 series. This time, we're going to talk about the 2 other practices of BDD. Last time we talked about discovery using examples. This time we're going to talk about formulation, where we write down those examples in a structured way for the computer to understand, and automation. So we're going to talk about formulation, how it fits into the BDD process, and automation, how they fit in. How we're going to talk about the Gherkin syntax, so that's like the specific way that we do formulation, good practices for doing formulation, and then automation. Just to like a kind of little overview of what automation is. Going to do you a little demo. So let's zoom out to this overall process diagram for BDD. We start with a user story. We need to have a conversation about that user story, so we do some discovery work together collaboratively as the 3 amigos. Now, once we've discovered the examples that we want to build, we're going to do formulation to express those examples in a way that the computer can understand, as well as the humans working on the story. Once we've done that formulation work, and remember this is just a small user story, so we're talking about a few examples, a couple of days of work, to deliver, I should say, not a couple of days of work to formulate. Maybe the formulation is going to take you an hour or 2. Once we're done with the formulation, then we can go on to automation to actually drive out the behavior using those tests, using test-driven development. So remember this example from last time. We talked about an example having these 3 component parts: a context, the situation, the state that the system is in before the example happens, an action, the thing that happens in the world that changes the state of the system, and then an outcome, when that action happens in that context. When we formulate our examples for the computer to understand, for a tool like Cucumber to execute them, we're going to use these 3 keywords to specify our context, action, and outcome. We're going to use given, when, and then. These are just special keywords that allow us to understand which part of an example we're looking at and to give it some structure, and this is where the formalization comes in, of formulation. So let's have a look at how that would work for a real example. Let's go back to our ATM example, and here we'll type it in into an IDE, right? So we can actually start to express this in a structured way that the computer is going to be able to understand. So I'm going to start by using the feature keyword. This is like a collection of scenarios. It allows us to put together a bunch of scenarios in a document. And we're allowed to write in the structured syntax for Gherkin. We're allowed to write any kind of preamble documentation we want. So this stuff up here is just giving us a way to express the user story. Then I'm going to start with a scenario. So scenario now, we're telling the computer we're talking about an example. You can see it's highlighted that keyword. So this is the one where we try and withdraw from an account with sufficient credit. So we write out a given step, put $1,000 in the account. Here's our action. And you can see we're already recognizing some existing steps there. And now we expect that when we withdraw $100 is debited from the account and it's received at the ATM. And we used a .feature extension. This is the extension that Cucumber and other similar BDD tools use for this Gherkin syntax. And there's only a few keywords in Gherkin: the feature, the scenario, given, when, then. You can also use and to chain the steps together, and but if you want to. And the other thing you could do is you can add rules. So just like in example mapping, we came up with the examples underneath of rules. So each example is illustrating a rule. We can also express the rules in Gherkin and group the scenarios together under rules. So why would you do formulation? Well, how does it help? Well, moving from a discussion about examples where you're probably just scribbling things down on index cards to structured text that could be read by a computer, it starts to add some precision. So you really have to think about what are the words you're using? What exactly is the context here? What exactly are the outcomes here? And that going down that extra level of detail can help you to discover new things you hadn't thought about. It also forces you to think about your domain language because, again, when you're writing it down for reels, you really have to pick the words you're going to use, and you start to think about what are the verbs and nouns here in this problem space that I'm working in. How do we describe this behavior in those terms? The other really nice thing about using formulation in this way is that we're writing documentation about the system, but we're going to keep it in source control, as we just saw, with the rest of the code for the system. And that's really helpful as the system evolves, because you've always got the documentation being versioned with the system and changing with the system. But the best thing about doing formulation, and in my opinion, the only reason to really do it, is so that you can automate. So if you're writing given when thens and you're not going to run them as automated tests, I can say that is a little bit wasteful. There's maybe better ways to express the behavior that you want to implement. But a great advantage that it gives you is that you're going to be able to actually run these as automated tests. Now let's have a look at how that works. So here's an example of us now running those tests that we wrote a minute ago using Cucumber. And you can see that Cucumber has failed the test. Now that you've seen the link between formulation and automation, hopefully you can start to see why the formulation the value really starts to kick in when you do the automation. Because what we end up with here, once we've started to use this technique on larger parts of our system and we've developed, several tens or even hundreds of scenarios, is that we have what we call living documentation. And that's where we have the scenarios acting both as documentation of the system, but also tests where we can validate whether that documentation is actually true and whether the system is behaving as we have expected, as we've specified. And that's really important, like having documentation that is alive as compared to, a Word document, which may drift out of date with the actual behavior of the system. You're able to constantly validate this documentation. That's why we say that it's living documentation, because it stays alive. And it's not easy. Moving from manual to automated testing is a big investment, and there's a lot to learn. And so if you're just trying to get the hang of Gherkin and get the feel of it, I encourage you to use formulation to get practice with using given when then. But really, you're going to get the most excellent feedback from the whole process, both in terms of how good your formulation is, but also, the feedback from these tests. If you're taking the formulated Gherkin scenarios and you're automating them as tests as well. And a couple of pieces of advice for doing that. One way I like to think of is the very first test that you automate is going to be the most complicated, expensive one to do. The second one's going to cost half as much. The third one's going to cost half as much again. And each time you add another test, it gets easier and easier because you're reusing more and more of the infrastructure that you built up for the other tests. Each one is, a variation on previous ones. So it can be really helpful to get that investment in both your skill at automating tests and also the infrastructure that you need to connect to your system and automate it. It can be useful to think about this concept of the slow lane. So where you might have 5 user stories in play on your team, instead of trying to do all 5 of those stories perfectly and use BDD just as I'm explaining in these videos by formulating and automating, maybe just pick one. Just pick one. Do the other 4 the way that you've always done them, but pick one and put it into the slow lane. And by slow, what we mean is we're going to use this story not as just a vehicle for delivering the value that's expressed in the story, but we're also going to use it as a vehicle for learning about how to do BDD, how to do automation. So we put that story into the slow lane. We let it take as long as it needs to fill that dual purpose of not only delivering the value specified in the story, but learning how to do the automation and investing in that infrastructure that we're going to need. And gradually, next time we can maybe do 2 stories, or we do a more complicated story in the slow lane. So pick a nice, easy one first. We pull a more complicated story into the slow lane next. And then gradually the slow lane can get wider and wider until it isn't the slow lane anymore. Because actually we can deliver these stories just as quickly or even quicker in the end than we would have done before. So think about using the slow lane as a way to help you to move from testing manually to doing automated testing. Okay, that was your brief introduction to formulation and automation, the further two practices of BDD. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.